welcome to St. Albans. My name is Michael Latta. I'm with the International Joint Commission of Canada and the United States. I'm a senior science advisor for the U.S. section. And with me tonight is my colleague Pierre-Yves Gault, who's Director of Science and Engineering for our Canadian section in Ottawa. I'd like to welcome, first off, Senator Brock, thank you for joining us, as well as Northwest Access Public TV to our event. To start off with, I'd like to describe or give you an IJC 101. We're a unique organization. We're an independent organization. We were established by the Boundary Waters Treaty of 1909. And our mandate is specific and very pointed to resolve and prevent conflicts between U.S. and Canada with regards to water apportionment and water quality. Now that's a huge mandate. We operate the whole U.S.-Canadian interface. We're very active also under the Great Lakes Quality Act in the Great Lakes, obviously dealing with nutrient loading specifically with Lake Erie. Our organization is evidence and fact-based. In doing so, we seek to integrate as many point of views as possible, ergo our public engagement tonight. One thing that we are not a decision-making body, and we do not implement any recommendations or enforcements. Okay? Our role is really to gather facts and provide governments with clear explanations of the problems and issues that they ask us to investigate. And we, in turn, we provide them with the concerns of stakeholders and concerns of public, and then we make recommendations to the governments, and then it's up to the governments to take that action further if they choose to do so. Now, here with us tonight, we have an appointed board of science policy experts, and we call them the Champlain Study Advisory Group, or the CSAG, and this group, as part of this group here, is helping us complete this task, which I'll describe to you in a minute. Now, I'm going to read verse here from what we call a reference. The government asked us to gather and review information from federal, provincial, state, municipal agencies, and academic institutions and other entities in this region on existing monitoring programs and measures being taken to address the reduction of nutrient loading and the causes of harmful algal blooms in Lake Champlain and Lake Memphremagog. Moving forward. Now, based on these evaluations, we engage with our key basin organizations, in this case OBVBM and Lake Champlain Basin Program. And the IJC ultimately will provide the government with a suite of recommendations. And these recommendations will contain a summary of gaps, an itemization of opportunities, identification of possible new approaches to strengthen our binational cooperation across the border. Again, the point of us being here, we are here to listen and incorporate the public's point of view with regards to the report that is currently public. I'm going to pass the mic and I'm going to have Pierre-Yves Gault introduce our panel.
Okay, I have the easy job.
You do. Do you want a mic?
And sure, can you hear me well? I can hear you. Can you hear me well? Okay.
Just in case.
Thank you. And so, starting on my left here, we have Eric Perkins, USA, Neil Cannon from USA as well, Stefanos Bitsikidis from Canada, Andrew Strum from UVM, Pierre Leduc, OBVBM, and Ryan Patch from the USA. So the Pierre from Canada, and Andrew's from UVM, USA. And we also have here Robert Michaud from the he's also part of the CSAG, which is we did a 12-member panel, 6 from each country. So I'll pass the microphone now for presentation to Eric Howe. Eric? Oh, you're starting.
The other Eric.
Yeah, just to keep it confusing, we have two Erics right at the beginning. I'm just going to go through a few slides and then actually hand it over to the other Eric. I'm going to try this mic. Can you hear me with this one? Okay. I'm going to speak close to it because my voice is not like Michael's, so loud and strong. And so I am the chair of the Science Advisory Group that Pierre-Yves just described. And I work with the US EPA out of the Boston office. I happen to live in Vermont, but I work out of the Boston office. And I've been involved in Lake Champlain issues for quite a few years, and most recently, or fairly recently, in an in-depth way through the Lake Champlain TMDL process. It was part of my responsibility to oversee that project. So that is partly why I was asked, along with all the other folks on the panel, to be involved in this project. So the objectives of the meeting today are mainly to share information with you. There's going to be a presentation that Eric will be delivering shortly that describes some of the key aspects of the report and the recommendations in the report. And we want to seek your input on this study and the recommendations in particular. And we want to encourage a dialogue, any questions of us that you might have. We'd like to be happy to answer any questions. And then we want to encourage people as well to share written comments by the December 14th deadline, in addition to any comments you may want to share tonight. So it's just a pretty simple agenda. The first hour, it'd probably be less than an hour, the presentation, and then including the recommendations. And then the second hour, we'll have opportunity for Q&A and comments from you. And this is just the last thing I'm going to mention, which is some of the people involved in this project. In addition to those of us that were just introduced now by Pierre-Yves, this slide lists the full Science Advisory Group membership, and you can see for the Canada side, there's representation from the Ministry of Environment, from the Ministry of Agriculture, from a county government water quality specialist. Aubert, who's here, is from a research institute that studies agriculture and the environment. And Pierre Leduc is with an organization that is somewhat comparable to the Lake Champlain Basin Program in Quebec. And he's also the co-chair of the Science Advisory Committee. And also Pierre is on the Citizens Advisory Committee to the Lake Champlain Basin Program. He's part of the steering committee for that group. And then, so I won't go through everybody that's on this slide, but just I wanted to make it clear that the way this project was structured, the IJC, the International Joint Commission, contracted with both the Lake Champlain Basin Program and then Pierre Leduc's comparable organization in Quebec to work on the literature review and compile the recommendations with input from all of us on the panel and with input from other experts in the basin and knowledgeable individuals through an interview process and other processes that Eric will mention. And I think that's it for now. I'll turn it over to you, Eric.
All right. Thank you, Eric Perkins. I am Eric Howe I'm the director of the Lake Champlain Basin Program and the Champlain Valley National Heritage Partnership. We are a part of NUIPIC. The logo was up on the screen a minute ago. Basin Program is based out of Grand Isle. The NUIPIC is out of Lowell, Massachusetts, and they also played a role in helping to develop some of this report that we're presenting today. So Eric kind of set me up to get to this point in the presentation. We developed this literature review and based on a lot of published information and also other gray literature from around the Missisquoi Bay area and the greater Lake Champlain region on water quality, looking at harmful algal blooms, the causes of algal blooms, nutrient loading. We also did some interviews with a few experts who work in the Lake Champlain region in particular on these concerns, compiled that information into a draft report. We worked with the Basin Program's Technical Advisory Committee, which is a committee of scientists who span the spectrum of watershed management issues on feedback on the report. Developed a series of recommendations and along with the final draft report, worked with the folks on the panel here, the science advisory group for the study, for the IJC, and then while that was happening, Quebec was also going through a similar process to get to the same point. And we then merged the recommendations from the US portion of the study and the Quebec portion of the study together and developed the draft binational report that is out for public comment right now. Some of you may have that in front of you. And that will be out for comment through December 14th. Okay, so just a little bit of a quick background information about the Lake Champlain Basin. I think most of you are probably pretty familiar with it. The Lake Champlain Basin obviously includes parts of Vermont and New York and Quebec. The Missisquoi Bay watershed is the binational part of the basin, which is shared by Quebec and Vermont. And there's my statistics. So Lake Champlain, the whole basin of Lake Champlain is a little over 8,200 square miles. Missisquoi Bay, that basin is 1,200 square miles for context. The bay itself is about 30 square miles across, and the average depth is 10 feet. So it's a large bay, but it's also shallow, which leads to some of the challenges that we have in managing the water quality of that bay. It is roughly a little bit less than 1% of the total volume of Lake Champlain, and the phosphorus load into Missisquoi Bay is about a quarter of the phosphorus load into Lake Champlain, into all of Lake Champlain. A lot of what I'm talking about tonight is focused on Missisquoi Bay, recognizing that we are doing this meeting tonight in Saint Albans. I think a lot of you are probably familiar with this slide. This is out of the Basin Program's State of the Lake report. We have hard copies of that report on the coffee stand back there in the back of the room. Please help yourselves to a copy if you'd like. But the idea of this illustration is to highlight the different targets for water quality around the different lake segments of Lake Champlain. And the one that's called out here is for Saint Albans Bay. You can see that the target concentration for phosphorus has been set at 17 micrograms per liter, and the average annual concentration of phosphorus in the bay has exceeded that every year since the monitoring program started in 1990. Some years it's greater than others. I don't have a trend line on there, but you can see that generally speaking, the average annual concentration has been increasing in St. Albans Bay since 1990. Missisquoi Bay, the target is a little bit higher just because of the nature of that system in the bay. The target is set at 25 micrograms per liter, also has been exceeded annually ever since the program started in 1990 by quite a bit, sometimes more than double of what the target is there for Missisquoi Bay. Just a little bit more about Missisquoi Bay. Over the life of the monitoring program, the average concentration of phosphorus in that bay has been 49 micrograms per liter, which again is about double what the target is, which then leads to the cyanobacteria bloom problems that we have been seeing in that bay for the past couple of decades. That leads to, obviously, to recreational impacts, but also to impacts the drinking water supplies that are pulling water out of Missisquoi Bay and tourism. So that's also affecting the economic engine of Missisquoi Bay. Where's the phosphorus coming from? In Quebec, roughly 79% of the phosphorus is coming from agricultural land uses. 16% is coming out of developed areas in the Quebec portion of the bay or basin, and 5% is coming out of forested and wetland areas. On the Vermont portion of the basin, similar, slightly different. 64% of the phosphorus is coming from agriculture, 30% is coming out of forested wetland areas, and 6% is from developed land uses or developed areas. As I think you all know, that the EPA required the state of Vermont to develop a phosphorus a phosphorus reduction plan to address the TMDL that was revised and published in 2016. Reduction targets were set, new reduction targets were set in that TMDL, and the goals there for Vermont are to reduce the total phosphorus load by 64%. And Quebec's ideally would reduce by about 55% or an average across the whole basin of 61% to achieve targets for loading into Missisquoi Bay, loading of phosphorus into Missisquoi Bay. So the problem is obviously too much phosphorus. I think you all know this is what happens with cyanobacteria blooms. Here's a nice aerial photo, or not so nice, I guess, aerial photo of cyanobacteria bloom filling up Missisquoi Bay, and some shots of what the close-up shots of what the blooms can look like. Another close-up of algal bloom washing up onto a shoreline. This is from Phillipsburg in 2018. Credit goes to Mr. Pierre Leduc for these photos. And another shot washing out through a tributary. Pierre and Christina in the back of the room and I worked to put together this little mock-up of a watershed model to kind of demonstrate, to work through this watershed model as we work through the presentation. And so this is your basic watershed, pre-human arrival. You have your forested land, and then the forested land drains into a tributary or into a waterway or pond or lake, and then it moves on out through the system. Then humans arrive and start doing things that we do in a watershed. We make changes, clear some trees, and build some buildings, and create some farms to grow food. So we introduce humans and livestock into the system. We impact the soils and start to grow crops to support the livestock and the humans. And that all, of course, will begin to affect the amount of phosphorus and sediment and other pollutants that are going into the waterways. So that phosphorus, the fertilizer, has to come from somewhere. This kind of charts the sources of phosphorus since 1800. Back in the golden days, most of the phosphorus came from manure. And then over time, it was discovered that phosphorus could be mined, and in the 1950s, new advances in technology allowed phosphorus mining to really take off, and basically the story here is lots and lots of phosphorus is now being mined and imported into watersheds around the world, and that is affecting the phosphorus balance that I'll get into a little bit later, but affecting the phosphorus balance of the not only Missisquoi Bay, but all of Lake Champlain and other lakes systems as well. Okay, so back to our watershed model. Now we were introduced to support our livestock and support people. We are now introducing or importing fertilizers that have phosphorus and other nutrients, and also food for our livestock. And the fertilizers applied to soils. Food goes into livestock, which then goes into the soils. And in theory, we're exporting some phosphorus and other nutrients in the form of milk and meat, and also from harvested crops. You can see that now we're starting beginning to affect or increase the amount of phosphorus that is going into the tributary and into the receiving water. Some of that phosphorus is stored in the soil, but other another amount of phosphorus is lost from the soil and either eroded or runs off the land into the receiving water, into the tributary, and then into the pond or the lake. We also have humans developing more and creating urban areas that will also increase runoff and delivery of more nutrients and sediment into the lake. There's your sediment. So the sediment now is receiving more nutrients, it's building up in the water body or the pond, and that phosphorus that's in those sediments is starting to interact with the water column. So some of that phosphorus is not just coming from the land, but also cycling up into the water column from the sediment. So there's even more phosphorus that's accessible for plants and cyanobacteria and other aquatic life in the pond. So the story here is that changes can be slow in an ecosystem. There are two large phosphorus storage areas that do react slowly. There's the soils. It takes a lot of time for that phosphorus, or has taken a long time for that phosphorus to build up in the soils, and then also in the sediment or the bottom of the lake. It's taken many decades to get to the conditions that we are experiencing now in Missisquoi Bay, Saint Albans Bay, other eutrophic water bodies in the region. And it's also, the expectation should be that it will take some time to recover from all of that, those decades of loading phosphorus into the bay. It's difficult to say how long exactly, but we should expect it to take a while. So, as I mentioned, there was a lot of background information that went into building this report. Really, the crux of the report are a series of recommendations that are, have been put together by the folks working in the study, including the Science Advisory Board. And so, as they were considering these recommendations, there were a number of principles that we thought about. The recommendations needed to be supported by sound science and research. It needed to be, all the recommendations needed to be grounded in science to ensure that the information that was put forward made sense and could be backed by science. They need to have a significant impact. They need to be able to make a difference. That's what we're looking for, is to accelerate the recovery of these water bodies and to eventually solve this problem of eutrophication of these bays. They need to be bold. We need to be able to actually step out of the line and make that difference, and not just do more of the same thing and recommend more of the same thing over and over. They need to be actionable. The report should not be shelved. We don't want a report that's just going to sit on somebody's bookshelf somewhere behind them. We want that report to sit right here next to their computer, so they're using it as they're making management decisions about the bay, whether it's St. Albans Bay, Missisquoi Bay, or anywhere else in the Lake Champlain Basin. We also wanted to have a limited number of priority recommendations. The group ended up with 6, and then they had a series of additional recommendations to follow up on those priority recommendations, and we ended up with a total of 16 additional recommendations. So I'm going to run through, well, not yet. One more slide. The recommendations are, because this is a study funded by the International Joint Commission, the recommendations are going to be addressed to the Canadian and U.S. governments, but also to state and provincial governments, local watershed groups, and stakeholders. This is intended to be a report that's useful to everybody, not just the government folks sitting in Washington, D.C. and in Ottawa. But it's also important to keep in mind that the recommendations may be applied differently in Quebec and in Vermont. They are two different jurisdictions, two different countries. Laws and regulations and rules are developed and applied differently in those two regions. And as I've mentioned several times already, it's important to understand that while this report is heavily focused on Missisquoi Bay, there are some special conditions there. A lot of these recommendations are applicable to the rest of the Lake Champlain Basin. And finally, we do not want to recommend an action that will perhaps act to the detriment of any individuals or companies. If there are, we understand the importance of agriculture to the region, particularly to the Missisquoi Bay region and communities, and the goal would be to identify ways to support farmers and producers to reduce their impact on water quality while maintaining or perhaps even improving the profitability of their businesses. And one way to do that, one approach to doing that, is identifying and targeting critical areas that are contributing more phosphorus per area of land per acre than other areas of land across the basin. Okay. priority recommendations. So those 6, I'm going to run through them real quickly, and then we'll go into them each of them in detail. So the first one is to establish and coordinate a binational phosphorus reduction working group to enhance cooperation and accountability of parties to achieve mutually agreed goals. So we want a task force here that will work, be focused on reducing phosphorus loading into Missisquoi Bay. The second will be to develop a binational mass balance for phosphorus imports and exports into the Missisquoi Bay or in the Missisquoi Bay watershed. This will be looking at a model looking at where phosphorus is coming from and where it's going and how it's cycling through that system. The third is to reduce the use of phosphorus on lands in the Missisquoi watershed. So how is phosphorus being applied, and are there ways to reduce those applications but maintain crop yields, for example, and productivity of farms? The fourth is to increase the proportion of cropping systems that exhibit less phosphorus loss. So what are there ways to adjust cropping systems, plant different crops that either don't use as much phosphorus or don't release as much phosphorus into the system? The fifth one is to increase protection and increase the area of floodplains, wetlands, and forest lands to make sure that they're reconnected to promote nutrient retention. We'd like these systems to serve as phosphorus sinks to the system, not as phosphorus sources to Missisquoi Bay or Lake Champlain. And then lastly, the sixth recommendation is to engage public stakeholders to commit the goals of safe water to the goals of safe water and healthy ecosystems. We're working with the public tonight, and we want to continue that and boost efforts to work with the public to help stakeholders understand the importance of their roles in the improving the ecosystem. Okay, so back to our watershed model. Where are we now? Urban areas. So I'm going to talk for a minute about urban areas. You may have noticed those 6 recommendations did not really discuss in any explicit way urban or developed lands. The idea behind that was because overall, the phosphorus loading into Missisquoi Bay, as I described earlier, there really isn't that much phosphorus coming into Missisquoi Bay from developed lands or urban lands. Altogether, it's somewhere between 6% and 16%, depending on which side of the border you're sitting on. So the advisory group wanted to really focus their priority recommendations on those areas, particularly agriculture, that are contributing the most phosphorus to Missisquoi Bay. That said, Pierre did a test run of this presentation with a test audience last week, and they asked him why urban or developed lands are not identified as a priority recommendation. And we thought about it and realized that, okay, there is a very heavy lift that has to happen to achieve phosphorus loading goals into Missisquoi Bay. And to meet that goal, we really need to achieve or address all of the phosphorus sources into Missisquoi Bay. And that includes even that small sliver of phosphorus coming in from developed lands. So we're proposing, and we'll discuss this with the advisory group over the next month or so, perhaps a 7th recommendation that does in fact look at developed areas in more detail. And that could potentially look at ensuring full compliance of wastewater infrastructure, implementing stormwater BMPs to reduce effects of combined sewer systems and overland storm flows, and encouraging practices to protect the water quality through regulatory tools on both sides of the border and at the state and provincial and also municipal levels. And again, this is something that we'll talk about as an advisory board over the next month before we finalize it. But this is something that's definitely worth a consideration. Okay, recommendation 1. So this is the one to form a permanent binational work group. And the common objectives here, again, are to achieve an average annual target concentration of phosphorus in the lake, total phosphorus of 25 micrograms per liter in the bay. That's the target or the goal for phosphorus loading. And then also to harmonize the collection and publication of data. Right now, the Basin Program supports a monitoring program on Lake Champlain with Vermont DEC and New York DEC. They have a system to go out, collect samples from the lake and from the tributaries, and then bring those samples back to the lab, and they're publish the data and publish reports. Quebec also has a similar program. They follow similar monitoring protocols, and we feel it'd be important to harmonize those two monitoring programs to make sure that they're augmenting each other and publish one set of data with hopefully a similar interpretation of those data. The Binational Work Group would develop, implement, and track an action plan to achieve goals by building on existing plans for Missisquoi Bay, and it would also serve as a standing subcommittee of the Lake Champlain Basin Program, or the Lake Champlain Steering Committee. This is a committee that, for those of you who are familiar with the Basin Program's TAC, or Technical Advisory Committee, this would be a similar committee of folks, equally populated with membership from the US and Canada, that is focused on looking at addressing phosphorus reduction goals for Missisquoi Bay. The work group will ensure accountability. They will report annually to the Lake Champlain Steering Committee, to the OBVBM board. OBVBM is the watershed group, Bay Missisquoi watershed group from Quebec, and then also to the public. And they would develop most likely an annual report that would be published for the public to interpret and understand what's going on there. And then lastly, ongoing funding. So the funding sources from provincial, federal, and provincial or state governments would be identified to help focus resources on Missisquoi Bay, addressing the rest of the recommendations that we'll be running through to try and achieve these goals. Recommendation number 2 is to develop a binational mass balance for phosphorus. In this model, we'd be looking at making sure we understand the sources of phosphorus, which include external, as I mentioned, what is being imported into the basin, Missisquoi Basin. How is phosphorus being cycled through the basin once it's in there and also in the bay? Where is it being stored? Is it stored in wetlands, soils, and what other places can we look for options or opportunities to store phosphorus? And then what is being exported? Milk, cheese, meat, other dairy products, other crop products. And then what loss? Where is that phosphorus going into how is that phosphorus getting into the water column, and then also eventually out into, down into the rest of Lake Champlain? And we want to use these results to help target our actions, help pinpoint and identify those critical areas, those critical control points for phosphorus coming into the basin, and try and reduce those, and also those sources of phosphorus once phosphorus is cycling within the basin, to take advantage, best bang for our buck, take advantage of the resources that we have to reduce phosphorus loading into the basin and into the bay. So I've mentioned critical area a couple of times. Critical areas are what we're considering about 50% of the phosphorus is coming from about 10% of the land area. So in this simple illustration, on the vertical axis of the graph, we have hectares or land area. On the horizontal, as you move from left to right, we have kilograms of phosphorus per hectare, or increasing phosphorus per land area. The average of that slope would be that almost just past the apex or the peak of the slope. The critical areas are the sites that fall to the right leg of that slope. That's where the sites are that have more phosphorus per square mile or per square meter or whatever, than the phosphorus, than the other sites of the area. So that's really where we should need to target our resources and get the best bang for our buck to reduce phosphorus loading into the bay. And again, these principles all apply to the rest of Lake Champlain Basin as well. So for Missisquoi Bay, we know where the critical areas are for much of the basin. That work has been done. Quebec has done that work for the Pike River watershed, the Rock River watershed, and with support from the International Joint Commission in 2011, that work was also done for the US portion of the Missisquoi Basin. So we've got a good start. Recommendation 3 is to reduce the use of phosphorus. So this is the one where we're trying to reduce the amount of fertilizer applied to lands, the amount of fertilizer imported into the basin, and the amount of manure that is applied to the land while maintaining yields. That's the key there, is we want to reduce the fertilizer applications, but try and make sure that farmers are still getting the yields from their crops that they need to sustain their businesses. And again, we need to target those critical areas. Phosphorus is stored in the soil, allows us to do this in many different places across the basin. And the soil is often richer than necessary, has more phosphorus than is needed to support most of the crops or many of the crops that are grown. There's always that risk, whether it's perceived or real, that farmers must take if they're going to change their fertilization rates or fertilizer application rates. And so we want to work with farmers to help get past that potential hurdle, and feel comfortable reducing their application rates of their fertilizers. So one approach would be to develop potentially something like a yield insurance plan, where if they don't get the yield within reason that they're expecting, perhaps this insurance policy could help compensate them for those potential losses. We also, in this recommendation, would work to review agronomic recommendations with emphasis on the need for plants and soil capacity to retain phosphorus, implement practices that would reduce residual phosphorus on the landscape and in soils, and then develop protocols for sustainable management of phosphorus in soils. We're would work with the group to study the processes and markets for transforming and exporting manure outside of the watershed. That's another great approach. Just send it somewhere else. We want it out of our basin. We'll send it over to Memphremagog or something. No. I'm just kidding. The IJC also has a sister program going to this that's addressing the same problem with Memphremagog. Where was I? Now I got myself all lost. And so the idea, again, is to identify those ways to reduce phosphorus coming into the basin and also export it, ideally in the form of goods, milk or cheese or other products. Okay, so this graph was generated by Stone Environmental from that CSA, that study that the IJC funded 8 years ago now. And the idea here is that they're looking at the amount of phosphorus lost per hectare, having problems with my T's all of a sudden. So that's the vertical axis on the right. Is my pointer going to work? Nope. All right, the left side of the chart along the x-axis, the horizontal axis is forested land use, then brush, and then you get into residential land uses, wetlands, and all the way on the right side are agricultural practices such as pasture, corn, hay rotations, corn, and then you get looking at farmsteads and soybean corn all the way to the right. So you can see that those practices end up with the most phosphorus lost per hectare. And then on the left side, forest, you have the least amount of phosphorus lost per hectare. So recommendation 3 is looking at reducing the height of those columns or those bars, where we're trying to do just as well by reducing the amount of phosphorus that's being applied to the land. And again, we're looking at targeting critical areas on the landscape, and hopefully, ideally, being able to offer financial support to the producers to address those critical areas. Recommendation 4 is to reduce phosphorus loss. So we're reducing the risk of erosion, particularly during winter and spring, but really year-round, as you all just witnessed on Halloween, the amount of erosion that happened in all the tributaries in this whole area. A lot of sediment was loaded into Lake Champlain just on that Halloween storm alone. One way to do that is to plant cover crops and intercrops. Most of the farmers are aware of this and should know how to do that and ways to do that. And then promote the management of crop residues in the spring. We also want to encourage transition from corn and soy. This tallest column, this tallest bar on this graph, down into other crops that have perhaps shorter columns or shorter bars, like cereal grains. And perhaps there's a way to do that through either market development or providing financial support or revisiting some of our grant programs that we have either at the federal, state, or local level or within the basin program. Yeah, okay. So recommendation number 4, again, is also looking at doing just as well with less phosphorus, but also changing the land use, changing those the crop types that are planted, and reducing and moving, again, cutting off the tops of those bars and moving to the left side of this graph. All right, back to our watershed model. So we were talking about urban areas. Now, we're looking at for recommendation 5, we're looking at increasing storage and filtration. So now we're looking at down in the model, we're looking at the phosphorus going into the tributary system and into the lake, and how that phosphorus could be stored before it actually arrives at the tributary or the water body. We're also looking at urban areas. How can we keep phosphorus from staying in the urban areas and not leaving those systems? Right, and one way to do that is by working on and building buffers along the riparian areas, along the lake shores to collect and capture phosphorus and other nutrients and pollutants that could be entering those systems at that point, and also in the urban areas, installing stormwater systems that would collect stormwater as it's running off the hard landscapes and allowing it to be collected and treated on site or as close to on site as possible before it reaches a waterway. So again, in recommendation 5, we want to promote nutrient retention by protecting our riparian areas and perhaps expanding protection of riparian areas and wetlands and also forested areas. We want to try and restore that dynamic balance of ecosystem services from the rivers and the riparian areas. And we also want to extend the withdrawal and conservation programs and recognize the economic benefits and ecological services that are provided by flood mitigation and also for wildlife habitat and biodiversity. Okay, recommendation 6, engage the public. Whoops. So this is the human element of the watershed model. All right, so engaging the public. Nothing can be done without political will. I think those of you in the room know that. And political will comes from political public pressure. Greta Thunberg, she got this figured out pretty quickly, or pretty nicely. She was able to activate millions of people around the world for climate change marches. I'm not saying we necessarily need to activate millions of people around the world for Missisquoi Bay, but I think you understand the scope of the problem here. We can activate the people who live in Missisquoi Bay, who live or work in Missisquoi Bay, or vacation and recreate in Missisquoi Bay or Saint Albans Bay or the rest of Lake Champlain. And if you can do that, then you can start to see more action from your elected officials. If you don't, one way to do that is to get yourself elected and push your priorities. I cannot advocate for that as a Basin Program Director, but you can. And what the Basin Program can do and OBVBM can do in Quebec is to increase public education and awareness efforts to encourage participation at the grassroots level, at the town and community level, and at the state level. The task force that we're recommending be created from recommendation 1 should report on the progress or lack of progress and results achieved to the public. And then the public can demand actions from their elected officials at all levels. And one easy question is to ask if your municipality has an action plan. Is your municipality talking about ways that they can reduce their impact on Missisquoi Bay or on St. Albans Bay or anywhere else in the Lake Champlain Basin? Okay, back to our watershed model. One last thing, we have these big giant storm systems that come rolling through. So, not channeling Greta Thunberg here, but a word on climate change. Governments do need to develop and implement measures to combat climate change. We need to consider impacts on hydrology as an additional challenge to achieving our water quality objectives. Again, referencing back to the Halloween storm, that's a very recent example of the challenges that we are seeing from increasing intensity and duration of storm events here in the Champlain Basin. We're also seeing increasing air and water temperatures. We've documented increases in surface water temperatures in Lake Champlain since the 1960s. And these extreme weather events are already leading to higher nutrient loads and consequently more frequent cyanobacteria blooms in the basin. All right, so back to our watershed model. Now that's the 6 primary or high priority recommendations. I'm going to quickly run through a few of the additional recommendations, and then I'm going to turn it over to you to ask these folks some questions. All right. So sediments, one additional recommendation is to take a look at sediments that have accumulated in Missisquoi Bay and Saint Albans Bay and other eutrophic embayments in the basin. We know that in situ restoration techniques, projects that are looking at reducing phosphorus that's actually in the bay have limited effectiveness and can be difficult given the size of some of these bays that we're looking at, Missisquoi Bay in particular, over 30 square miles. It's a very large bay, but it's also very shallow, which makes it very difficult to address this particular situation with the amount of phosphorus that's been accumulated in the sediments. Anything that you do try to do there is going to be very expensive. So the recommendation here is to look at improving our understanding and modeling of phosphorus movement in the bay to facilitate the study of sediment management or neutralization or removal techniques that will eventually need to be addressed. Where are there hotspots in the bay that can be tackled rather than trying to tackle all of the sediments across the whole bay? Are there particular hotspots or critical sources, critical areas in the sediments of the bay that can be dealt with to reduce phosphorus that's cycling up into the water column and causing these algal blooms? Additional recommendations are looking at financing and regulations, perhaps expanding incentive programs to increase the implementation of BMPs across the landscape, across all the different land uses for the basin. Again, we need to address everything if we're going to achieve the phosphorus loading goals into Missisquoi Bay or St. Albans Bay. An additional bullet for agriculture is to look at fertilizer application rates and standards and equipment to encourage nutrient incorporation into the soil. We're going to make sure that the investment farmers are making in purchasing that fertilizer, what fertilizer they do purchase, is actually incorporated into the soil and is being consumed by their crops and isn't just running off their land into the waterways. That's literally water or money washing off of their property. And then lastly, research. We always need to continue supporting research, identifying ways to improve our understanding of how phosphorus is cycling through the system, and also to look at new ways to reduce the impact of phosphorus loading into the basin. Okay, so for more information, I just gave you for more information, the report has a lot of background information to support those recommendations. The report is not a comprehensive summary of all the work that's been happening in Missisquoi Bay and across the Lake Champlain Basin. That would be a massive tome to read through. But you can find the report and a lot of supporting information on the IJC's website for this project, ijc.org/en for English. If you want French, hit FR/LCLM. That's Lake Champlain, Lake Memphremagog. Just a smattering of some of the links you can find there. These are the English and US reports that are provided on that page, and also a series of French and Quebec reports that are provided as well. The public comment period is open now. It will close on December 14th. You can email your comments to lclm@ottawa.ijc.org. You can go to that website to submit your comments, or you can ask us questions or offer your comments and questions right now or through the comment cards that you all should have found on your seats.